The Fair Finance Coalition of Southern Africa is expected to release a report today on the financing of the climate crisis at the 27th United Nations Climate Talks in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt. The report will look at rates by public financial institutions on transparency and accountability, climate response performance, and new power generation. Let's talk about this with Zahra Omar from the Center for Environmental Rights. A very good afternoon to you, Zahra. Thank you for your time. You are at the climate conference in Sharm el Sheikh. Let's talk about the financial institutions referred to in this report and their role in addressing the climate emergency.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. Yes, so I'll start off with what are public finance institutions. As you mentioned, the Fair Finance Coalition launched this policy assessment into 6 public finance institutions in Southern Africa. And essentially, when we talk about public finance institutions, we're talking about banks, development banks, trust companies, asset managers, all controlled and owned by government, and all that use public funds for their financing and for their investments. And the reason why this is so important in the context of the climate crisis is that it's these banks that are ultimately providing finance for our developmental infrastructure. It is these banks that are providing financing and investment in fossil fuels, further locking our region into fossil fuel dependency and exacerbating the climate crisis.
And you were talking about policy assessment in laying out what's expected at this launch today. What exactly are you looking at in terms of policy, and what is it generally, and what should it be?
So we assessed the public finance institutions' policies across 8 themes. And because of the specific work that the member organizations of the Fair Finance Coalition do, our report only focused on 3 of those themes. So it was climate change, power generation, and transparency and accountability. So essentially what we assess is to what extent the bank's policies comply with international standards and best practices in relation to climate change, in relation to power generation, and in relation to transparency and accountability. So, for example, we assess whether the banks measure and disclose the greenhouse gas emissions associated with their financial portfolios.
And when you began to do that assessment, Zahra, what did you find? What stood out most?
So what we found overall was that while these 6 public finance institutions are financing renewable energy projects in Southern Africa, at the same time they're not shifting away from fossil fuel financing. And so they have published statements and intentions to exclude financing of fossil fuels from their portfolios, but we found that no action has followed those statements.
So there's a lot of talk about what has gone wrong or needs addressing as far as the global climate change response. Given what you have been looking at, what is the way forward? How do you recommend that these institutions correct, shall we say, their behavior or their stance?
So because of the critical role that these banks play in financing our development in the region, we recommend that as a first step, these banks should establish fossil fuel exclusion plans or policies with clear timelines and targets for phasing out fossil fuels. We also recommend that they align their policies with the 1.5-degree Paris Agreement target and to make meaningful commitments to comply with those targets. And then we also recommend that they improve the level of disclosure overall of their policies, the sustainability of their policies, and then lastly, to engage with us as the Fair Finance Coalition to use the Fair Finance Guide methodology to help improve their policies going forward, and from there on also improve their practices.
So climate change related reports such as yours are many that are released annually sometimes. When you look at what is put out by organizations such as yourself and the response from the various governments of the world, why do you think that the response, even though the world leaders say they hear what you are saying, has been lacking?
I think it's political interest. It's a disproportionate attention given to economic growth over the protection of our environment, over the protection of our future generations, protecting our planet for them. And I think that this disproportionate attention has been given to economic growth for decades now, and what we find is that it hasn't worked for us. The world is in a disaster. We are in a climate emergency. And if we don't reform our financial institutions, if we don't reform the global economic system now, we will find ourselves in an even greater emergency.
So much of it is about treating climate change as an ongoing process versus a calendar event in the form of COP, for example, 27 this year. There'll be 28 next year. So for the financial institutions whom you've been looking at, for instance, how do we keep the engagement going post Sharm el Sheikh?
I think, well, as the Fair Finance Coalition Southern Africa, we'll keep doing these policy assessments annually, not just as a tick box exercise, but we'll use it to engage with these financial institutions to make sure their policies are changing and to make sure that they understand the seriousness of the situation and the urgency of the situation. As the public, we can put pressure on our governments. I mean, these financial institutions are all state-owned, so essentially it is government-backed, it is government that owns them. And government dictates what the policies should look like. So keep putting pressure on our government, use social media, use whatever means you can, because we are in a climate emergency.
Zahra Omar, pleasure to speak to you. Zahra is with the Center for Environmental Rights. They'll be launching a report at the ongoing COP27 summit underway at Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt.